Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change a man's entire life. In the dusty frontier town of Cedar Ridge in 1887, a moment of generosity would shatter every assumption about worth and family. When Samuel Hayes, one of the wealthiest cattle ranchers in Texas, rode into town that scorching afternoon, he had no idea his forgotten wallet would lead to his most important encounter. As the townsfolk gathered to witness a rich man's embarrassment, a barefoot little girl named Ruby stepped forward with 3 worn pennies. But what secret would her simple kindness reveal that connected their lives forever? Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This deeply heartwarming frontier tale will surely stay with you long after the final word is so beautifully spoken. Samuel Hayes pulled the silver pocket watch from his vest and studied its familiar weight in his weathered palm. The ornate engravings caught the morning light streaming through the windows of his sprawling ranch house. Initials intertwined in elegant script, S.H. and E.H., surrounded by delicate roses that his late wife Elizabeth had chosen herself. 9 years had passed since those initials meant anything more than a painful reminder of what he'd lost. The Hayes Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of the richest grazing land in East Texas, dotted with prime Angus cattle that fetched top dollar in the stockyards of Fort Worth. Samuel had built his empire through shrewd business sense, tireless work, and an iron will that brooked no nonsense from man nor beast. At 42, he commanded respect from every rancher, banker, and businessman from Austin to the Louisiana border. His word was his bond, his handshake better than any contract, and his wealth spoke louder than words in a territory where gold and cattle ruled all conversations. Yet for all his success, Samuel Hayes was a man haunted by solitude. The grand house that Elizabeth had decorated with such care now felt like a mausoleum. Her piano sat silent in the parlor, sheet music still arranged, as she'd left it the morning she went into labor. The nursery upstairs remained untouched, painted yellow, because they'd wanted to be surprised. Samuel had closed that door 9 years ago and never opened it again. The servants, cook, housekeeper, and ranch hands moved through their duties with quiet efficiency, but Samuel knew they whispered among themselves about the melancholy that had settled over their employer like dust after a long drought. He ate his meals alone at a table built for 8, conducted his business with polite formality, and rode his vast property line with only his thoughts for company. Elizabeth had been everything Samuel thought he'd never find on the frontier. Educated, refined, with a laugh that could make the hardest day worthwhile. She'd arrived in Cedar Ridge as the new schoolteacher, bringing books and manners from back east, though she'd quickly adapted to frontier life with a resilience that surprised everyone. Their courtship had been brief but intense, and their 2 years of marriage had been the happiest of Samuel's life. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start. Elizabeth had been sick constantly, weak and pale, but determined to bring their child safely into the world. Dr. Whitmore had warned them of complications, spoke in hushed tones about difficult births and the dangers women faced in childbirth. Samuel had hired the best midwife in 3 counties, an older black woman named Martha, who had a reputation for gentle hands and wise knowledge passed down through generations. But wisdom and gentle hands hadn't been enough. Elizabeth died during a long, agonizing labor on a cold February night, and Dr. Whitmore emerged from the bedroom with blood on his sleeves and defeat in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Samuel," he'd said, his voice thick with whiskey and exhaustion. "We lost them both. The baby never drew breath." Samuel had demanded to see his child, but the doctor insisted it would only cause more pain. Martha had taken the tiny body away to be buried, and Samuel had been left with nothing but grief and a silver pocket watch that no longer marked time in any meaningful way. On the other side of Cedar Ridge, where the neat town lots gave way to a cluster of ramshackle cabins and shanties, lived the people who served the prosperous white families but were never invited to their tables. Here, laundry fluttered on lines strung between weathered posts. Children played in dusty yards with toys made from scraps and imagination, and every penny earned was a penny desperately needed. Martha Washington, she'd chosen the surname herself after emancipation, lived in a small but tidy cabin with her granddaughter Ruby. At 68, Martha carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had survived slavery, war, and the harsh realities of freedom in a land that offered it grudgingly. Her hands, scarred from years of hard labor, were surprisingly gentle when tending the sick or delivering babies. She'd been the unofficial doctor for the black community since settling in Cedar Ridge 15 years ago, and even some white families had quietly sought her help when their own physicians had failed them. Ruby was 8 years old, with skin the color of warm honey and startling green eyes that seemed too wise for her young face. She was small for her age, but quick and clever, with an innate kindness that sometimes worried her grandmother. In a world where showing too much heart could be dangerous for a black child, Ruby's impulse to help anyone in need was both her greatest virtue and Martha's greatest fear. Every morning, Ruby walked into town to do odd jobs, sweeping storefronts, carrying packages, helping elderly women with their marketing. She was polite to everyone, never asked for more than fair payment, and saved every penny she earned in a small tin hidden beneath her mattress. The white townspeople had grown accustomed to the well-mannered little girl who worked so hard, though few bothered to learn her name or wonder about her circumstances. Martha watched her granddaughter's interactions with the white world with a mixture of pride and terror. Ruby had been raised to be respectful, hard-working, and invisible when necessary, survival skills that every black child learned whether they wanted to or not. But Ruby's natural empathy sometimes overcame her caution, and Martha lived in constant fear that her granddaughter's kind heart would lead her into trouble she couldn't escape. The arrangement worked because Ruby was careful, Martha was wise, and the white families of Cedar Ridge were comfortable with the established order. Ruby knew which back doors to use, when to speak and when to stay silent, and how to make herself useful without being threatening. It was a delicate balance that protected them both, but Martha knew it was built on foundations as fragile as morning frost. Cedar Ridge itself was a town caught between its rough frontier past and its aspirations for civilized respectability. Main Street boasted a hotel, 2 saloons, a bank, and Henderson's General Store, which served as the unofficial center of town gossip and commerce. The church anchored one end of the street, its white steeple pointing toward heaven like a moral compass, while the railroad depot at the other end promised connection to the wider world beyond the dusty plains. Henderson's General Store was where most of the town's business was conducted. James Henderson, a portly man with mutton chops and shrewd eyes, kept track of every transaction, every debt, and every piece of gossip that crossed his threshold. His wife, Dorothy, managed the store's social functions, deciding which families were worthy of credit and which should be watched with suspicion. The store served customers of all backgrounds, but the unspoken rules were clear. White customers shopped during prime hours and were waited on first, while black customers came early in the morning or late in the evening and conducted their business quickly and quietly. It was a system that maintained order, even if that order was built on inequality that no one discussed openly. Among the regular white customers were the town's leading families: the banker Cornelius Wright, the hotel owner William Morrison, and of course, Samuel Hayes. When Samuel came to town, which was rarely, he commanded immediate attention. Store clerks rushed to serve him, other customers stepped aside respectfully, and Dorothy Henderson fussed over him like visiting royalty. But Samuel took no joy in the deference. He conducted his business efficiently, paid his accounts promptly, and left without the social pleasantries that other wealthy men seemed to enjoy. The townspeople respected his success and mourned his tragedy, but they also whispered that 9 years was long enough to grieve, and that a man of his standing should remarry and start a new family. Samuel ignored such advice. He had no interest in replacing Elizabeth, no desire to risk his heart again, and no patience for the matchmaking schemes of well-meaning neighbors. He'd built a life of comfortable isolation, where emotional safety came through distance and control through independence. Yet sometimes, when the silver pocket watch caught the light just right, Samuel could swear he heard an echo of Elizabeth's laughter. And sometimes, in dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking, he imagined a child's voice calling him Papa, a sound that filled him with longing for something he'd never had and never would. Neither Samuel Hayes nor young Ruby knew that their lives were about to intersect in a way that would challenge everything they thought they understood about family, kindness, and the secrets that time refuses to bury. The silver pocket watch continued its steady ticking, marking moments toward a revelation that would transform them both, while 3 worn pennies waited in a tin box for their moment to change the world. The August heat shimmered off Main Street, like waves from a forge, when Samuel Hayes rode into Cedar Ridge that Tuesday afternoon. His brown leather boots stirred small clouds of dust as he dismounted from his bay gelding and tied the reins to the hitching post outside Henderson's general store. The familiar weight of his wallet pressed against his hip, or so he thought. Samuel pushed through the store's heavy wooden door, the brass bell announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed to brighten the dimly lit interior. The smell of leather goods, pickle barrels, and fresh bolts of fabric filled his nostrils as he nodded curtly to James Henderson, who immediately abandoned his conversation with Mrs. Patterson to attend to his most important customer. "Mr. Hayes! Good to see you, sir. What can I do for you today?" Henderson's voice carried the eager tone reserved for men whose accounts were always paid in full and on time. Samuel consulted the list he'd written in his careful script. "Need 20 pounds of flour, coffee, salt pork, and some of that hard candy Mrs. Henderson makes." He paused, his eyes scanning the shelves. "And I'll take one of those wooden horses from the toy section." Henderson raised an eyebrow. Samuel Hayes buying a child's toy was unusual enough to merit comment, but the rancher's expression discouraged questions. "Certainly, sir. The Maplewood horse with the real horsehair mane? That'll do fine." Samuel couldn't explain why he'd decided to purchase the toy. Something about its craftsmanship had caught his eye, the way the unknown woodworker had carved each detail with obvious care. Perhaps he'd donate it to the church for some deserving child. As Henderson bustled about, gathering the items, other customers began to take notice. Samuel Hayes in town was always an event worth observing. Mrs. Patterson nudged her sister-in-law and whispered behind her gloved hand. Young Timothy Morrison stopped examining fishing hooks to stare at the legendary cattle baron. Even old Pete Garrison, who was usually too deep in his cups to notice much of anything, straightened up from his slouch against the counter. Henderson arranged Samuel's purchases on the counter with the care of a man handling precious artifacts. "That comes to $12.37, Mr. Hayes." Samuel reached for his back pocket, where his brown leather wallet always rested. His fingers found empty fabric. He patted his other pockets, a frown creasing his weathered face. Left vest pocket, only his pocket watch. Right vest pocket, his reading spectacles. Shirt pocket, nothing but a piece of hard candy he'd forgotten about. "Something wrong, Mr. Hayes?" Henderson's voice carried a note of concern that was beginning to attract more attention. "Seems I've left my wallet back at the ranch." Samuel's voice remained steady, but he could feel the eyes of the other customers turning toward him with interest that bordered on amusement. Henderson's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then barely concealed panic. In 15 years of running his store, he'd never faced the situation of Samuel Hayes being unable to pay for his purchases. Well, I'm sure we can work something out, Mr. Hayes. Perhaps you could send one of your men back with payment later today." But the damage was already done. Mrs. Patterson was no longer bothering to whisper, and her voice carried clearly across the store. "Well, I never." Even the richest man in the county can be forgetful, I suppose. Timothy Morrison snickered. Guess. Money can't buy you a good memory. Old Pete Garrison found this hilarious. Rich man without his wallet. That's like a cowboy without his horse. His laughter turned into a coughing fit that only made the situation more uncomfortable. Samuel felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He wasn't accustomed to being the object of ridicule, and certainly not over something as mundane as a forgotten wallet. The brown leather wallet that contained not just his money, but the last photograph taken of Elizabeth before her illness, a picture he carried everywhere but rarely looked at. "The ranch is 20 miles out," Samuel said quietly. "By the time I ride back and return, it'll be near dark." Henderson wrung his hands. "Of course, Mr. Hayes, we could arrange. No need for arrangements." Samuel's pride was kicking in, the same stubborn independence that had built his fortune. "I'll come back tomorrow with proper payment." He turned to leave, his purchases still. Sitting on the counter when a small voice from near the door stopped him cold. "Mister, I can help." Everyone in the store turned to see Ruby standing just inside the doorway, her worn dress neat but clearly patched in several places, her bare feet dusty from the walk into town. In her small hand, she clutched 3 pennies that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. The store fell completely silent. Even old Pete's coughing stopped. Ruby took a hesitant step forward, her green eyes fixed on Samuel's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I heard you forgot your money. I got 3 cents saved up. It's not much, but maybe it'll help." Mrs. Patterson's mouth fell open. Timothy Morrison stopped snickering. Henderson looked like he might faint. Samuel stared at the little girl, his mind trying to process what was happening. A black child, a poor black child, was offering to pay his debt with what was obviously every penny she owned. The social implications alone were staggering, but beyond that, Samuel found himself looking into eyes that seemed hauntingly familiar. "Child," he said softly, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "That's very kind of you, but 3 cents won't cover what I owe." Ruby's face fell slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "I know it's not enough, mister. But Grandmother Martha always says that when folks help folks, God finds a way to make it work out right." Henderson found his voice first. "Ruby, you get on out of here. This isn't your concern." But Samuel held up a hand to stop him. Something about this moment felt significant in a way he couldn't explain. The little girl's green eyes, the earnestness in her voice, the simple generosity of her offer. It stirred something in his chest that had been dormant for 9 long years. "What's your name, child?" "Ruby, sir. Ruby Washington. I live with my grandmother Martha on the east side of town." Samuel knelt down so he was at eye level with her, ignoring the shocked expressions of the white customers behind him. Up close, Ruby's resemblance to someone was even more striking, though he couldn't place who. "Ruby, why would you want to help a stranger?" She considered this question with the seriousness of a child who'd been taught to think before speaking. "You looked sad when everyone was laughing. Nobody should be laughed at for forgetting something. Everyone forgets things sometimes." The simple wisdom of her answer hit Samuel harder than any sermon he'd ever heard. Here was a child who had every reason to avoid involving herself in white folks' business, offering her meager savings to spare a rich man's embarrassment. Samuel reached out slowly and closed Ruby's small fingers around the 3 pennies. "You keep your money, Ruby, but I want you to know that what you offered means more to me than you could understand." He stood up and faced Henderson. "Put my purchases on my account. I'll settle up tomorrow." Henderson nodded quickly, relieved to have a solution that didn't involve further social awkwardness. But Samuel wasn't finished. He turned back to Ruby, who was still standing there clutching her pennies, looking up at him with those extraordinary green eyes. "Ruby, I want to do something for you to thank you for your kindness." "What would make you happy?" Ruby shook her head. "I don't need nothing, mister. I'm just glad I could help, even if it wasn't enough." Samuel felt something crack open inside his chest, a wall he'd built around his heart to protect it from further pain. This child's pure, uncomplicated generosity was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Well, I need something," he said. "I need to know there are still good people in the world. You've given me that gift today, Ruby Washington. I won't forget it." As Samuel walked out of Henderson's general store, leaving his purchases to be delivered, later he couldn't stop thinking about Ruby's eyes and her simple act of kindness. Behind him, the store erupted in whispered conversations about what they'd just witnessed. Ruby walked home slowly, still clutching her 3 pennies, unaware that she'd just set in motion events that would change her life forever. The brown leather wallet sat forgotten on Samuel's dresser, its hidden photograph waiting to reveal secrets that would shake both their worlds to their foundations. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual, every mile giving Samuel more time to think about the little girl with the green eyes and the generous heart, Ruby Washington. Even her name seemed to echo in his mind as his horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. He kept seeing her face, the earnest way she'd offered her 3 pennies, the quiet dignity with which she'd accepted his refusal. But it was her eyes that haunted him most. Where had he seen eyes like that before? The Hayes ranch house sat like a monument to prosperity against the vast Texas sky, its wraparound porch and tall windows speaking of wealth earned through hard work and careful planning. Samuel's foreman, Carlos Mendez, was waiting in the stable yard with the day's reports, but Samuel waved him off with an uncharacteristic abruptness. "Tomorrow, Carlos. Whatever it is can wait until tomorrow." Samuel climbed the front steps 2 at a time, his boots echoing on the wooden porch. Inside, the house felt stuffier than usual, filled with the weight of silence and memories. He headed straight for his bedroom, where his brown leather wallet lay on the dresser, exactly where he'd left it that morning. He picked up the wallet with hands that were suddenly unsteady. The leather was worn smooth from years of carrying, softened by the warmth of his body and the passage of time. Samuel opened it slowly, revealing the bills and coins that would have paid his account at Henderson's store, but his attention was drawn to the small compartment behind the money. With careful fingers, he extracted a photograph that had been tucked away for years, its edges softened with age and handling. Elizabeth smiled back at him from the sepia image, her face radiant with the particular glow that had made pregnancy beautiful on her despite the sickness. The picture had been taken just 2 months before their world fell apart, when they'd still believed that love and hope were enough to guarantee a happy ending. Samuel sank into the leather chair beside his dresser, the photograph trembling in his hands. Elizabeth's eyes looked back at him from across 9 years of grief and loneliness, eyes that were remarkably, unmistakably green, the same shade of green as Ruby Washington's eyes. Samuel's mind raced backward through time to that terrible February night when his world had shattered. Elizabeth had been in labor for 18 hours, her cries echoing through the house, despite Martha's gentle encouragements and Dr. Whitmore's increasingly worried consultations. Samuel had paced the parlor, wearing a path in the carpet, while praying to any god who might be listening. When the crying stopped, Samuel knew something was wrong. Dr. Whitmore had emerged from the bedroom with blood on his white shirt and defeat written across his face. The man reeked of whiskey. Samuel could smell it even through his own panic and grief. "I'm sorry, Samuel," the doctor had said, his words slightly slurred. "We lost them both. Elizabeth fought as hard as any woman I've ever seen. But the baby never drew breath. Samuel had demanded to see his child, but Whitmore had refused. It would only cause you more pain, he'd insisted. Some things are better left as they are. Let me spare you that burden." Martha had appeared in the doorway then, her dress stained and her face streaked with tears. In her arms, she carried a small bundle wrapped in one of Elizabeth's favorite quilts. She'd looked at Samuel with eyes full of sorrow and something else, something that might have been guilt or fear. "I'll take care of everything," she'd whispered. "You don't need to worry about any of it," and she had. Martha had handled all the arrangements, the burial, the quiet ceremony that put both wife and child to rest in the small cemetery outside town. Samuel had been too numb with grief to question any of it, too lost in his own pain to wonder why. He'd never actually seen his child's face. Now, staring at Elizabeth's photograph and remembering Ruby's green eyes, Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Meanwhile, across town in the small cabin that Ruby called home, Martha Washington was trying to understand why her granddaughter had returned from her daily errands with a smile that could light up the entire room. Ruby sat cross-legged on her narrow bed, her worn rag doll, lovingly crafted from fabric scraps, and filled with cotton from Martha's sewing basket, cradled in her arms. The doll's face had been embroidered with careful stitches, its yarn hair braided with tiny ribbons that Martha had saved from her midwife work. It wasn't much to look at, but it represented every bit of love and creativity Martha could pour into a gift for the child who had become her whole world. "Grandmother Martha," Ruby said, her voice bubbling with excitement, "something wonderful happened today at Henderson's store." Martha looked up from the beans she was sorting for dinner, her weathered hands stilling in their work. Ruby's enthusiasm was infectious, but it also made Martha nervous. In their world, wonderful things that happened in white establishments often came with dangerous complications. What kind of wonderful child? Ruby launched into her story with the animated gestures of a born storyteller. She described Samuel Hayes and his forgotten wallet, the way the other customers had laughed at his embarrassment, and her own decision to offer her saved pennies to help him. With each word, Martha felt her heart sinking lower in her chest. "You offered your money to Samuel Hayes?" Martha's voice was carefully controlled, but Ruby was too young to recognize the warning signs. "Yes, ma'am. I know 3 cents wasn't enough to pay his whole bill, but I thought maybe it would help some. He was so kind about it, Grandmother Martha. He knelt down to talk to me like I was somebody important, and his eyes were so sad and gentle." Martha set down the beans with hands that shook slightly. Samuel Hayes, after 9 years of careful distance, of building a life that kept them safe from questions and complications, Ruby had walked right up to the one man in Cedar Ridge who could destroy everything. "Ruby," Martha said slowly, "you listen to me, and you listen good. You stay away from Samuel Hayes. You hear me? You don't talk to him, you don't help him, and you certainly don't go taking your hard-earned money to solve his problems." Ruby's face fell, confusion replacing her earlier joy. "But Grandmother Martha, he seemed so nice, and he was sad when everyone was laughing at him. Nice or not, he's not for you to worry about." Martha's voice carried an edge that made Ruby shrink back against her pillow, clutching her rag doll tighter. "That man lives in a different world from us, child. A world where little black girls who get too friendly can find themselves in serious trouble. But I was just trying to help. I know you were, baby. I know your heart is good. But goodness alone won't protect you in this world." Martha sat down on the edge of Ruby's bed, her expression softening slightly. "Samuel Hayes lost his wife and child 9 years ago. Since then, he's been a man with nothing left to lose. That makes him dangerous in ways you can't understand." Ruby considered this, her young mind trying to reconcile her grandmother's warning with her own impression of the sad-eyed rancher. "He didn't seem dangerous, Grandmother Martha. He seemed lonely." Martha's heart clenched at her granddaughter's perceptiveness. Ruby saw too much, understood too much, felt too much for her own good. It was a blessing and a curse that would either make her extraordinary or get her killed. "Lonely men do foolish things," Martha said finally. "Promise me, Ruby. Promise you'll stay away from Samuel Hayes." Ruby nodded reluctantly, though Martha could see the confusion and hurt in her green eyes. Those eyes that had been her secret joy and her constant terror for 8 long years. After Ruby fell asleep that night, clutching her rag doll and whispering prayers for the sad cowboy who'd been so kind to her, Martha sat in her rocking chair and faced the truth she'd been avoiding for nearly a decade. Samuel Hayes was asking questions. Martha had seen the way he'd looked at Ruby in Henderson's store. She'd heard about it within hours of it happening because news like that traveled fast in a small town. He'd looked at Ruby the same way he used to look at Elizabeth, with a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. Martha had always known this day might come. She'd prepared for it, dreaded it, and hoped against hope that it never would. But Ruby's act of kindness had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped, and Martha could feel the careful world she'd built beginning to crumble around her. She pulled out her sewing basket and began working on a new dress for Ruby. Her fingers moving automatically through familiar motions while her mind raced through possibilities and prayers. The ragdoll sat watching from Ruby's bed, its embroidered eyes seeming to hold secrets of their own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new choices that would determine the fate of the child Martha loved more than her own life. But tonight, she would sew and plan, and hope that 9 years of secrets would be enough to protect them from the storm that was surely coming. Samuel Hayes had never been to the east side of Cedar Ridge. In 9 years of living near the town, he'd had no reason to venture into the collection of small cabins and shanties where the black families made their homes. The contrast with Main Street was stark, where the white section of town boasted painted storefronts and neat boardwalks. Here the buildings were weathered wood and packed earth, functional rather than decorative. Yet as Samuel rode slowly down the narrow lane that served as the area's main thoroughfare, he was struck by the sense of community that seemed to emanate from every yard and doorway. Children played together while their mothers watched from porches, men gathered around a game of checkers in the shade of an old oak tree, and vegetable gardens flourished behind neat fences despite the hard soil. Samuel had come with a purpose that he couldn't fully explain, even to himself. The memory of Ruby's green eyes had haunted him through a sleepless night, and he'd awakened with an overwhelming need to see her again, to convince himself that the resemblance to Elizabeth was merely his imagination playing tricks on a man. He'd also brought money, far more than 3 cents, enough to establish a small account for Ruby at Henderson's store, or perhaps fund some improvement to her family's circumstances. It was the least he could do for a child who'd shown him such unexpected kindness. Finding the Washington cabin proved easier than expected. Ruby was sitting on the front steps, carefully mending a tear in her dress with tiny, precise stitches that spoke of careful instruction. When she looked up and saw Samuel approaching on horseback, her face broke into a smile that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "Mr. Hayes," Ruby jumped to her feet, setting aside her sewing. "What brings you to our side of town?" Before Samuel could answer, the cabin door flew open, and Martha Washington emerged like a protective lioness defending her cub. Her eyes, sharp with intelligence and suspicion, fixed on Samuel with an intensity that made his horse shift nervously beneath him. "Ruby, get inside," Martha commanded, her voice brooking no argument. "But Grandmother Martha, it's the nice man from the store, inside. Now." Ruby's confusion was evident, but she obeyed, gathering her sewing and disappearing into the cabin with one last curious glance at Samuel. Martha stepped to the edge of her small porch, positioning herself between Samuel and her home like a sentinel. At 68, she was still a formidable woman, her back straight and her bearing proud, despite the worn fabric of her dress and the calluses on her hands. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "what business brings you here?" Samuel dismounted and removed his hat, trying to project the respectful manner his mother had taught him when addressing any woman, regardless of race or station. "Mrs. Washington, I came to thank Ruby properly for her kindness yesterday, and to offer some compensation for her generous spirit." "We don't need your money," Martha replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Ruby was raised to help folks when she can. That's just her nature. I understand that, ma'am. But I'd like to do something to show my appreciation. Perhaps I could arrange for Ruby to have an account at Henderson's store, or—" "No," Martha's voice cut through his words like a blade. "We take care of our own, Mr. Hayes. We don't need—" And charity from white folks, no matter how well-intentioned. Samuel studied the older woman's face, noting the way her jaw was set and her hands clenched at her sides. This wasn't simple pride speaking. This was fear. But fear of what? "Mrs. Washington, may I ask you something?" Samuel's voice was gentle, almost conversational. "Ruby has the most unusual eyes, such a distinctive shade of green. They remind me of someone, though I can't place who." Martha went very still, and Samuel saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, panic, something that confirmed his growing suspicions. "Eyes are just eyes, Mr. Hayes. Ruby got hers from her mamma, God rest her soul. And who was Ruby's mother, if you don't mind my asking?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Martha's dark eyes met Samuel's blue ones, and for a moment neither spoke. "My daughter," Martha said finally, "died when Ruby was born. Fever took her." It was a reasonable answer, a believable story. But Samuel had spent enough years negotiating, or cattle deals, to know when someone wasn't telling the complete truth. "I see. And Ruby's father? Gone before she was born. Some traveling man who made promises he didn't keep." Martha's voice carried the weight of old pain, and Samuel found himself believing this part of the story. "Mr. Hayes, I'll ask you again. What do you want with my granddaughter?" Samuel replaced his hat and prepared to mount his horse, but he couldn't resist one more question. "Mrs. Washington, you've lived in Cedar Ridge for some time. 15 years come October. And before that?" Martha's face closed down completely. "Before that is my business, Mr. Hayes, just like your business is yours." As Samuel rode away from the Washington cabin, he was more convinced than ever that Ruby's story was more complicated than it appeared. The child's green eyes, Martha's defensive answers, the timeline that put the older woman in Cedar Ridge around the time of Elizabeth's death. It all pointed to secrets that someone was working very hard to keep buried. Back in the cabin, Ruby pressed her face to the window and watched Samuel's retreating figure with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "Grandmother Martha, why were you so mean to him? He was just trying to be nice." Martha sank into her rocking chair, suddenly feeling every one of her 68 years. "Ruby, child, there are things about this world that you're too young to understand. Sometimes being nice isn't enough. Sometimes it can even be dangerous. But he has such kind eyes. They remind me of someone, but I can't think who." Martha's heart nearly stopped. If Ruby was beginning to sense the connection, if her own instincts were leading her toward the truth, then time was running shorter than Martha had feared. That evening, after Ruby had fallen asleep, Martha retrieved a wooden box from its hiding place beneath the loose floorboard under her bed. The box was old, its corners worn smooth by years of handling, and it contained the most precious and dangerous items Martha owned. Inside were the mementos of her years as a midwife, thank you notes from grateful families, pressed flowers from happy occasions, and tucked beneath everything else, the documents and records she was never supposed to keep. Midwives in the black community rarely maintained written records. It was safer for everyone involved if births and deaths remained matters of memory rather than documentation. But Martha had always been careful, perhaps too careful. She'd kept records because someone needed to remember these children, these women, these moments of life and death that shaped families and communities. Even when it was dangerous, even when it was forbidden, Martha had preserved the truth in her careful handwriting. Her fingers found the document she was looking for, the one she'd hidden away 9 years ago with the hope that it would never be needed. The birth certificate was written in her own hand, dated February 15th, 1879, and recorded in the careful script she'd learned from the missionary teachers of her youth. The document told a story that would shatter 2 families if it ever came to light. It confirmed Martha's worst fears and greatest hopes, written in ink that had faded but never disappeared. Ruby stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like "Papa" in the soft voice of a dreaming child. Martha carefully replaced the document and closed the wooden box, but she knew that no hiding place would be safe enough if Samuel Hayes continued asking questions. Outside, the night sounds of the east side of town continued their familiar chorus. Crickets and distant laughter, the soft sounds of families settling into sleep, but Martha sat awake in her rocking chair, holding vigil over secrets that were becoming harder to keep with each passing day. Ruby's innocent kindness had set wheels in motion that Martha was powerless to stop. The child she'd raised and loved was drawing the attention of the one man who could claim her legally, financially, and socially. But claiming Ruby would mean taking her away from everything she'd ever known, everything that had shaped her into the remarkable child she'd become. Martha closed her eyes and prayed for wisdom, for time, and for the strength to protect Ruby from a truth that could destroy the only family the child had ever known. Samuel Hayes stood in the office of Jeremiah Cole, private investigator, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight that slanted through unwashed windows. The office smelled of stale tobacco and old paper, but Cole had come highly recommended by Samuel's banker as a man who could find answers to questions others wouldn't ask. "I want you to look into the background of a family," Samuel said, placing a roll of bills on Cole's scarred wooden desk. Quietly, discreetly, the Washington family on the east side of town. Cole was a thin man with sharp eyes and the patient manner of someone accustomed to other people's secrets. He made notes in a worn leather journal as Samuel spoke, asking occasional questions that demonstrated his understanding of the delicate nature of the investigation. "Particular interest in the child, I gather?" Cole's pen hovered over his notes. "Ruby, Washington, 8 years old, lives with her grandmother, Martha. I want to know everything about her origins, her birth, her parents." Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. "There may be irregularities in the official records." Cole nodded without judgment. In his line of work, irregularities were more common than accurate documentation, especially when it came to births and deaths in the black community. "This investigation, is it related to a legal matter, Mr. Hayes?" "It may become one," Samuel replied. "For now, I simply need to know the truth." As Samuel left Cole's office, neither man noticed Martha Washington's small figure hurrying past the alley entrance. She'd been returning from a difficult birth on the north side of town when she'd spotted Samuel's distinctive horse tied outside the building that housed the territory's only private investigator. Martha's heart hammered in her chest as she made her way home through back streets and familiar shortcuts. Samuel Hayes hiring an investigator could mean only one thing. He suspected something about Ruby's origins. All of Martha's careful planning, all her years of building a safe life for Ruby, were suddenly at risk. That evening, Ruby noticed her grandmother's agitation immediately. Martha moved through their evening routine with distracted efficiency, checking the door locks twice and peering out the windows at shadows that had never concerned her before. "Grandmother Martha, are you feeling poorly?" Ruby asked, looking up from the primer she'd borrowed from the church school. Reading came easily to her, another gift that made Martha both proud and worried. "Just tired, child. It's been a long day." But as Ruby slept that night, she began having dreams that were more vivid than any she'd experienced before. In these dreams, she walked through rooms with high ceilings and polished wooden floors, played in gardens where roses bloomed in careful rows, and sat at a table where sunlight streamed through windows dressed in lace curtains. Most strangely, in these dreams, a woman with green eyes like her own held her close and sang lullabies in a voice that felt familiar, despite Ruby having no memory of hearing it while awake. When Ruby woke, she could never quite remember the words of the songs, but the melody lingered in her mind like an echo of something precious and lost. Meanwhile, Jeremiah Cole was proving his worth as an investigator. Within 3 days, he'd learned that Martha Washington had indeed been the most sought-after midwife in 3 counties, with a reputation for handling difficult births that other practitioners couldn't manage. He'd also discovered that several prominent families had quietly sought Martha's services over the years, including some who wouldn't publicly admit to relying on a black woman's expertise. More intriguingly, Cole found gaps in the official records around the time of Ruby's birth. The county register showed no birth certificate for Ruby Washington, which wasn't unusual for black children born at home, but it also showed no death certificate for Ruby's supposed mother and no record of any Washington daughter living in Cedar Ridge before Ruby's appearance. Cole's investigation took a more interesting turn when he began interviewing longtime residents about Martha's history in town. Old Mrs. Patterson remembered Martha arriving in Cedar Ridge in the spring of 1879, carrying a baby and claiming to be a widow seeking a fresh start. But Mrs. Patterson also remembered that Martha had seemed unusually prosperous for a woman in her circumstances, with good clothes and a small savings account at the bank. When Cole presented his preliminary findings to Samuel, the rancher's suspicions crystallized into near certainty. "She arrived in town just 3 months after my wife died," Samuel said, staring at Cole's notes. "Carrying a baby she claimed was her granddaughter." "The timeline is certainly suggestive," Cole agreed. "But Mr. Hayes, I should warn you that pursuing this line of inquiry could have serious social and legal implications. If your suspicions are correct, then a woman stole my child and let me grieve for 9 years while my daughter grew up in poverty." Samuel's voice was quiet, but Cole could hear the dangerous undertone of controlled fury. The next phase of Samuel's investigation led him to Dr. Whitmore's office, where he found the physician looking considerably older and more frail than he remembered. Whitmore's hands shook slightly as he poured himself a generous measure of whiskey, despite the early hour. "Samuel, I wondered when you might come asking questions," Whitmore said before Samuel had even spoken. "That business with the little girl at Henderson's store has the whole town talking." "Tell me about the night my wife died," Samuel said. "Tell me about my child." Whitmore drained his glass and poured another. "Samuel, that was 9 years ago. I had been drinking that night, more than I should have. Elizabeth's labor was difficult, complicated. There was so much blood. Did you see my child? Did you examine the baby?" Whitmore's hands trembled as he set down his glass. "There was chaos, Samuel. Martha was there, helping, but Elizabeth was dying, and I was trying to save her. When it was over, Martha took care of everything. She said the baby never breathed, but you never saw the body yourself." The old doctor's silence was answer enough. Back at the Washington cabin, Martha could feel the walls closing in around them. Ruby's questions about her dreams, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered Henderson's store, the way people looked at Ruby with new curiosity, all of it pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. "Ruby," Martha said one evening, as they sat together mending clothes by lamplight, "what would you think about taking a trip? Maybe visiting some family down in Louisiana?" Ruby looked up from her sewing with surprise. "What family? You always said we didn't have family anywhere else." Martha's heart clenched at her granddaughter's innocent confusion. 9 years of protecting Ruby had required so many small deceptions that Martha sometimes lost track of which stories were real and which were necessary fabrications. "Well, there might be some distant cousins, people who'd be happy to meet you, but—" Ruby shook her head firmly. "I don't want to leave Cedar Ridge, Grandmother Martha. This is our home. Besides, what if Mr. Hayes comes back to visit? He was so sad, and I think he needs friends." Martha closed her eyes, feeling the weight of secrets that were becoming too heavy to carry. Ruby's attachment to Samuel, her innocent desire to help the man who was unknowingly her father, was breaking Martha's heart, even as it terrified her. That night, Martha retrieved her hidden wooden box once again and pulled out the faded birth certificate she'd written in her own careful hand 9 years ago. The document told the true story of Ruby's birth, recorded in ink that had turned brown with age, but remained perfectly legible. The certificate recorded the birth of one female child to Elizabeth Hayes on February 15, 1879, attended by midwife Martha Washington. It noted that the mother died from complications of childbirth, but that the child was born alive and healthy. In the margin, in Martha's smaller script, were the words that had guided her decision 9 years ago. Mother's final wish: protect child from father's world. Martha had never intended to keep the certificate. She'd written it out of habit, the same careful documentation she maintained for all the births she attended. But when the moment came to destroy it, she couldn't bring herself to eliminate the only official record of Ruby's true origins. Now, as she held the fragile document in her weathered hands, Martha realized it might be her only protection against Samuel's growing suspicions. The certificate proved that Ruby was indeed Samuel's daughter, but it also recorded Elizabeth's dying words about keeping the child away from her father. The question that kept Martha awake through another sleepless night was whether those words would be enough to protect Ruby from a man who had the law, society, and unlimited resources on his side. Samuel Hayes was no longer just a grieving widower. He was becoming a father, determined to reclaim his child, regardless of the cost to the only family Ruby had ever known. The morning Martha decided to tell Ruby the truth dawned grey and heavy, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like omens of the upheaval to come. Ruby sat at their small kitchen table, carefully braiding her hair in the way Martha had taught her, humming one of the mysterious melodies from her dreams. "Ruby, child, we need to talk." Martha's voice carried a weight that made Ruby's hands still in her hair. "Are you sick, Grandmother Martha? You've seemed so worried lately." Martha sat across from Ruby, her weathered hands folded on the table between them. For 68 years, she'd faced every challenge life threw at her with courage and determination. She'd survived slavery, war, and the countless hardships of freedom in a hostile world. But nothing had prepared her for the conversation she was about to have with the child she loved more than life itself. "Ruby, honey, what I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to understand, but you're getting old enough to know the truth about your beginnings." Ruby's green eyes, those impossibly familiar green eyes, focused on Martha's face with sudden intensity. "You remember how I told you that your mama was my daughter, and that she died when you were born?" Ruby nodded, her expression growing more serious. "Well, that wasn't exactly the truth, child. Your mama, your real mama, was a white lady named Elizabeth Hayes. She was married to Samuel Hayes, the man you helped at the store." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Ruby stared at Martha without comprehension, her young mind struggling to process information that changed everything she thought she knew about herself. "I don't understand," Ruby whispered. Martha reached across the table and took Ruby's small hands in her own. "Elizabeth Hayes was having a baby, but the birth was very difficult. I was there helping as the midwife. Dr. Whitmore, he was drunk and not thinking clear. When your mama died, he told your papa that you had died too. But you hadn't, child. You were alive and breathing and perfect." Ruby's face had gone pale, and Martha could see the confusion and fear building in her eyes. "But why? Why didn't you tell Mr. Hayes that I was alive?" "Because your mama, in her final moments, she made me promise something. She was scared that if you grew up in that big house with all that wealth and white society, you'd learn to be ashamed of the part of you that wasn't white. She wanted you raised with love and pride in who you are, all of who you are." "What do you mean, the part of me that wasn't white?" Martha took a deep breath. This was the hardest truth of all to share with a child who'd been raised in a world where such distinctions meant everything. Your mama Elizabeth, she had some black heritage in her family line. It wasn't something she talked about. It wasn't safe for her to talk about it. But she knew that you might show those features, and she was scared of what that would mean for your life. Ruby touched her own face with trembling fingers, as if seeing herself clearly for the first time. "So, Mr. Hayes, he's my papa?" "Yes." "Child, he's your papa, and he's starting to figure that out for himself." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses' hooves in the yard outside. Martha rose and peered through the window to see Samuel Hayes dismounting from his gelding, his face set with grim determination. Behind him rode Sheriff Coleman and another man Martha didn't recognize. "Ruby, go to your room and stay there," Martha commanded, but it was too late. Samuel's boots were already echoing on the porch steps. The knock on the door was firm, but not aggressive. When Martha opened it, she found herself face to face with the man she'd been dreading to confront. "For 9 years. Mrs. Washington," Samuel said, his voice carefully controlled. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Martha stepped outside, closing the door behind her to shield Ruby from what was about to unfold. "Mr. Hayes, I don't know what you think you've discovered. I know that you took my daughter," Samuel interrupted, his composure cracking slightly. "I know that you let me believe she was dead for 9 years, while you raised her as your own." "I saved your daughter," Martha shot back, her own protective instincts flaring. "That drunk doctor would have let her die if I hadn't been there. And I kept her safe from a world that would have torn her apart." Samuel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You had no right to make that choice. She's my child, my flesh and blood." "She's also Elizabeth's child," Martha replied firmly, "and Elizabeth made me promise to protect her from exactly this situation." The argument might have escalated further, but the door opened behind Martha and Ruby emerged, her face streaked with tears, but her chin raised with a dignity that reminded both adults of her mother. "Stop fighting about me like I'm not here," Ruby said, her young voice cutting through the tension. "I can hear every word you're saying." Samuel's anger dissolved the moment he saw Ruby's distress. For the first time, he truly looked at the child, not as a curiosity or a mystery to be solved, but as his daughter. He could see Elizabeth in the shape of her eyes, in the way she held her head when she was upset, in the stubborn set of her jaw. "Ruby," he said gently, kneeling down to her level as he had that first day in Henderson's store, "I know this is confusing and frightening, but I want you to know that I'm not angry with you. You didn't do anything wrong. Are you really my papa?" Ruby asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Yes, sweetheart, I am." Ruby studied his face with the same intensity he'd noticed before, and Samuel realized she was looking for similarities between them. "You have blue eyes, but sometimes they look green in the light, like mine do." "Just like yours," Samuel agreed, his voice thick with emotion. The reunion might have been touching if not for the legal and social complexities that surrounded it. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his expression uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Hayes, if what you're saying is true, then we have a serious situation here. Taking a child from its rightful parents, even if the parents think the child is dead, well, that's a complicated legal matter." Martha's face went rigid with fear. "I didn't steal her. I saved her life." "Maybe so," the sheriff replied, "but the law is the law. If Mr. Hayes can prove paternity, he has legal rights that supersede any informal arrangements." Ruby looked back and forth between the adults, her confusion and distress growing with each exchange. "I don't want anyone to go to jail because of me," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't want anyone to be hurt." Samuel reached out slowly and touched Ruby's shoulder. "No one's going to jail, Ruby. We're going to figure this out like civilized people." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel could see the fear in Martha's eyes and knew that the situation was far more complicated than simple custody arrangements. Ruby had been raised as a black child in a segregated society. She'd learned to navigate a world where her very existence challenged racial boundaries that most people took for granted. Taking her from Martha's care and bringing her into his world wouldn't just mean changing families. It would mean changing her entire identity and social position. And Samuel was beginning to understand that Ruby's connection to Martha wasn't just about the woman who'd raised her. It was about who Ruby had become under that care. As the conversation continued on Martha's front porch, neighbors began to gather at respectful distances, whispering among themselves about the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Word spread quickly through both sides of town. Samuel Hayes, the richest white man in the county, was claiming that a black child was his daughter. The implications rippled through Cedar Ridge like stones thrown into still water. At Henderson's store, customers debated the legal precedents and social consequences. At the church, congregation members discussed the moral dimensions of the situation. And in the black community, families worried about what Samuel's claim might mean for all of them. Ruby found herself at the center of a storm she didn't fully understand, torn between love for the grandmother who'd raised her and curiosity about the father she'd never known she had. As the adults around her argued about laws and rights and improper procedures, Ruby clutched the small wooden box where she kept her 3 pennies and wished she'd never offered them to the sad-eyed stranger in Henderson's store. The act of kindness that had seemed so simple at the time had set in motion forces that would forever change 3 lives and challenge everything Cedar Ridge thought it knew about family. A race and the power of love to transcend society's rigid boundaries. 3 days after the confrontation on Martha's porch, Samuel Hayes sat in the office of Judge Harrison Morrison, Cedar Ridge's territorial magistrate, waiting for what he expected to be a straightforward legal proceeding. He'd brought documentation proving his marriage to Elizabeth, witnesses to testify about Ruby's resemblance to his late wife, and the services of the territory's most experienced lawyer. What he hadn't expected was to see Martha Washington enter the courthouse carrying a worn leather satchel, her face set with the kind of determination that had carried her through decades of hardship and struggle. "Your Honor," Martha said, her voice clear and strong despite her age, "before you make any decisions about this child's future, there are things you need to know. Things that will change how you see this whole situation." Judge Morrison, a fair-minded man who'd known Samuel for years, gestured for Martha to approach. "Mrs. Washington, you understand that you're not represented by counsel in this matter?" "I understand, Your Honor, but I've got something that speaks louder than any lawyer could." Martha opened her satchel and withdrew a slim volume bound in faded blue leather. "This here is Elizabeth Hayes' personal journal, covering the last months of her life." Samuel shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "That's impossible. Elizabeth's journal was destroyed in a fire at the house years ago. I saw it burn myself." Martha's eyes met his across the courtroom, and her expression held a mixture of sorrow and vindication. "No, Mr. Hayes, you saw a different journal burn, one I gave you to put your mind at ease. This is the real one, the one Elizabeth asked me to keep safe until the day came when the truth needed telling." Judge Morrison accepted the journal with careful hands, noting the delicate condition of the paper and the faded ink of Elizabeth's careful script. "Mrs. Washington, how did this come to be in your possession?" "Elizabeth gave it to me during her labor, Your Honor. She knew she was dying, had known it for days, though she didn't tell her husband. She made me promise to keep this journal and to use it to protect her child if the time ever came." Samuel's lawyer objected to the admission of evidence that hadn't been previously disclosed, but Martha had come prepared for such challenges. "Your Honor, I've also got this." Martha produced the faded birth certificate she'd written 9 years ago, along with Elizabeth's wedding ring, a delicate band set with small diamonds that Samuel recognized immediately. "Elizabeth gave me her ring as proof of what she was asking me to do," Martha explained. "She said if anyone ever questioned my right to speak for her child, I should show them the ring and the journal together." Judge Morrison examined the ring, noting the inscription inside, "SH to ELH forever." He looked up at Samuel with raised eyebrows. "Mr. Hayes, can you verify this is your wife's wedding ring?" Samuel nodded mutely, too stunned to speak. He'd searched everywhere for that ring after Elizabeth's death, had assumed it was lost or stolen. "Your Honor," Martha continued, "I'd like you to read the entry from February 10th, 1879, 5 days before Elizabeth died." Judge Morrison opened the journal carefully and found the date Martha had specified. In Elizabeth's neat handwriting, he read aloud, "The pains are getting stronger, and I fear I won't survive this birth. I've written to my cousin in Baltimore, asking her to send the records of our family lineage that I've kept hidden all these years. Samuel doesn't know the truth about my heritage. I've never found the courage to tell him that my grandmother was a mulatto woman who passed for white when she married my grandfather. I can feel in my heart that this baby will show those features I've spent my life hiding. The child will be beautiful, but in this world, beauty won't be enough to protect her from the cruelty that comes with mixed blood. If Samuel tries to raise her in his society, they'll tear her apart with their questions and their judgments. She'll never know peace in that world, always wondering if she's white enough, always afraid someone will discover her secret. Martha understands these fears. She's promised me that if something happens to me, she'll take my baby somewhere safe, somewhere she can grow up proud of all her heritage instead of ashamed of part of it. I trust Martha more than I trust Samuel with this burden. Samuel's love is true, but his understanding of this world's cruelties is limited by his privilege. He would try to hide our daughter's heritage, would try to whiten her for her own protection, and in doing so would teach her that part of herself is shameful. Pray I survive to raise my child myself, but if God calls me home, I trust Martha to honor the promise she's made. Let my daughter know she's loved for exactly who she is, in all her beautiful complexity." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Morrison finished reading. Samuel's face had gone ashen, and he sank back into his chair as if the words had physically struck him. Martha's voice was gentle but firm as she continued her testimony. "Elizabeth spent her last conscious hours telling me about her family, about the fear she'd lived with all her married life, about the choice she was making for her daughter's future. She didn't want Ruby raised in shame, Your Honor. She wanted her raised in pride." Judge Morrison set down the journal carefully. "Mrs. Washington, are you saying that Ruby Washington is of mixed race?" "Yes, Your Honor. Elizabeth was what some folks call high yellow, light enough to pass for white, which she'd been doing since she came west. But she carried African blood in her veins, and she knew her daughter might show it more clearly than she did." Samuel finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Elizabeth never told me. In 2 years of marriage, she never said a word." Martha's expression softened with sympathy. "She was scared, Mr. Hayes. Can you blame her? Look how you're reacting to finding out now, after she's been dead 9 years. How do you think she felt, carrying that secret while pregnant with your child?" Ruby, who had been sitting quietly in the front row beside one of Martha's friends, suddenly stood up. Her young voice cut through the adult conversation with startling clarity. "Is that why I look different from the other children? Is that why my skin gets darker in the summer and my hair curls when it's humid?" All eyes turned to the 8-year-old girl who had become the center of this legal and emotional storm. Ruby's green eyes moved from Martha to Samuel to the judge, seeking understanding in a situation that even the adults were struggling to comprehend. Martha knelt down beside Ruby's seat, speaking to her with the tenderness of 9 years of shared love. "Yes, baby, that's why you're so beautiful and so special. You got the best of both worlds in your blood, your mama's strength and your papa's determination, your mama's grace and your papa's stubbornness." Samuel rose slowly and approached his daughter, his mind reeling from revelations that changed everything he thought he knew about his wife, his child, and himself. "Ruby," he said carefully, "how do you feel about learning this about yourself?" Ruby considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I feel different, but not bad different. Like I understand things about myself that I never understood before, like those dreams I've been having about the big house and the lady." With green eyes, Judge Morrison watched this exchange with the careful attention of a man accustomed to weighing complex human emotions against the requirements of law. "Mr. Hayes, given this new information, how do you wish to proceed with your custody claim?" Samuel looked from Ruby to Martha, then back at the journal that contained his wife's deepest secrets and fears. For 9 years, he'd mourned not just Elizabeth's death, but the loss of the child he'd thought died with her. Now he had to confront the possibility that Elizabeth had been right to fear his reaction, right to doubt his ability to raise a mixed race, daughter in a hostile world. "Your Honor," Samuel said slowly, "I need time to think. This changes everything I thought I understood about my wife's wishes and my daughter's needs." Martha nodded approvingly. "That's the wisest thing you've said yet, Mr. Hayes. This child's future isn't about what any of us want. It's about what's best for her." As the court session adjourned, Ruby walked over to Samuel with the directness that had characterized their first meeting in Henderson's store. "Papa," she said, using the word for the first time, "I'm still the same person who offered you her pennies that day. Learning about my mama doesn't change that. Does it change anything for you?" Samuel knelt down and looked into his daughter's extraordinary green eyes, Elizabeth's eyes, but also eyes that held the wisdom and strength that Martha's love had nurtured. "No, Ruby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It doesn't change anything about who you are, but it changes everything about how I need to learn to be your father." The journal lay open on the judge's bench, Elizabeth's words still echoing in the courtroom, like a voice from beyond the grave, reminding everyone present that some decisions about love and family transcend the simple boundaries of law and social convention. The legal custody papers arrived at Martha's cabin on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Sheriff Coleman with the uncomfortable formality that came with serving court documents on someone he'd known and respected for 15 years. The papers were imposing in their official language and territorial seal, but Martha could read well enough to understand their fundamental message. Samuel Hayes was petitioning the court for full custody of Ruby Washington, citing his paternal rights and his ability to provide superior care. Martha set the papers on her kitchen table and stared at them as if they might disappear through sheer force of will. She'd known this moment would come from the instant Samuel had looked into Ruby's green eyes, but knowing hadn't made the reality any less devastating. Ruby found her there an hour later, still sitting motionless before the legal documents that would determine her fate. "Grandmother Martha, what are those papers?" Martha's voice was steady, but Ruby could hear the pain underneath. "They're papers that say your papa wants the law to decide where you should live. But I live here, with you. This is my home. I know, baby, I know." Ruby climbed into Martha's lap, something she hadn't done since she was much younger. At 8 years old, she was getting too big for such gestures, but the enormity of the situation called for the comfort of familiar rituals. "Are you going to have to go to court and fight him?" Martha smoothed Ruby's hair with gentle fingers. "I expect I am. But Ruby, child, you need to understand something. The law sees things different than the heart does. Your papa has money, and he's white, and he's your blood father. Those things carry weight in a courtroom. But you're my family too," Ruby whispered. "You're the only mama I've ever known, and I always will be, no matter what any judge says. Love doesn't get undone by pieces of paper." Word of the custody battle spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed of wildfire. By evening, the entire town had taken sides, with opinions as sharply divided as the racial lines that normally kept the community segregated. At Henderson's general store, the white customers generally supported Samuel's claim. "Blood is blood," declared Mrs. Patterson, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never questioned the natural order of things. "That child belongs with her father, where she can have proper advantages." But even among the white community, there were dissenting voices. Dr. Whitmore, sobered by his role in the original deception, spoke quietly to anyone who would listen about Martha's skill as a midwife and her dedication to Ruby's welfare. "That woman saved more lives than I ever did," he admitted to the hotel owner. "Maybe she saved that child's life in ways we don't fully understand." The black community rallied around Martha with the fierce loyalty of people who understood that an attack on one of their own was an attack on all of them. Families whom Martha had helped through difficult births came forward to testify about her character and competence. Women whose children she'd delivered spoke of her gentle hands and wise counsel. Men whose wives she'd saved during complicated labors offered to do whatever they could to support her cause. But everyone, black and white alike, understood the harsh reality of territorial law in 1887. Samuel Hayes had legal rights that no amount of moral argument could overcome. The best Martha could hope for was some arrangement that would allow her to remain part of Ruby's life. Samuel, meanwhile, was discovering that legal victory might come at a cost he hadn't anticipated. As he met with his lawyer to prepare the case, he found himself questioning not just Martha's actions, but his own motivations and his wife's final wishes. Mr. Hayes, his lawyer explained with the clinical detachment of professional counsel, the law is clear on this matter. You are the child's biological father. You have the financial means to provide for her welfare, and you have legal standing that supersedes any informal arrangements made in your absence. The court will almost certainly rule in your favor. And, if Martha fights it, she has no legal standing to prevent you from claiming custody. At best, she might be granted visitation rights, but even that would be at the court's discretion. Samuel stared out the window of the lawyer's office at the dusty street below, watching ordinary people go about their daily business while his own world had been turned upside down by revelations about his wife's secrets and his daughter's heritage. The contradiction tore at him constantly. He loved Elizabeth more than life itself, but how could he reconcile that love with the knowledge that she'd hidden her racial heritage throughout their marriage? How could he honor her memory while feeling betrayed by her lack of trust in his ability to accept her truth? Martha, sensing Samuel's internal conflict, began sharing stories about Elizabeth that painted a more complete picture of the woman he'd married and lost. She used to come see me even when she wasn't expecting, Martha told Samuel during one of their increasingly frequent conversations about Ruby's future. She'd bring books, and we'd talk about things she couldn't discuss with anyone else. The fear she carried about being discovered, it was like a stone in her chest that never got lighter. She could have trusted me, Samuel said, the hurt evident in his voice. I would have loved her regardless. Would you, though? Martha's question was gentle but pointed. Think honestly, Mr. Hayes. If Elizabeth had told you on your wedding night that she carried African blood, would you have been ready to face what that meant? The whispers, the social ostracism, the questions about your children's legitimacy. Samuel wanted to answer yes immediately, but Martha's steady gaze forced him to consider the question seriously. In 1878, when he'd married Elizabeth, would he have been prepared for the social complications of a mixed-race marriage? Would he have been strong enough to protect both his wife and his children from a society that condemned such unions? The honest answer shamed him. Ruby, caught between the two adults who loved her most, began showing signs of strain that worried both Samuel and Martha. She'd always been a cheerful, outgoing child, but the stress of the custody battle was taking its toll. She became withdrawn and anxious, jumping at sudden noises and losing interest in activities she'd previously enjoyed. The panic attack started on a Thursday morning while Ruby was helping Martha with the washing. Without warning, Ruby began hyperventilating, her small body trembling as she struggled to catch her breath. I can't breathe, Grandmother Martha. I feel like the walls are closing in. Martha held Ruby close, recognizing the symptoms of a child overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. It's going to be all right, baby. Just breathe with me, in and out, slow and steady. When Samuel heard about the panic attack, his own distress multiplied tenfold. The custody battle that was supposed to reunite him with his daughter was instead traumatizing her in ways that might cause lasting damage. The formal custody hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and both sides prepared their cases with the thoroughness that such high stakes demanded. Samuel's lawyer assembled documentation of his financial stability, character witnesses from the business community, and expert testimony about the advantages Ruby would enjoy as his acknowledged daughter. Martha's defense was more modest, but no less heartfelt. She had letters from families she'd helped, testimony from community members who could speak to Ruby's happiness and development under her care, and the moral argument that she'd been honoring Elizabeth's explicit wishes. But as the hearing date approached, Ruby made a decision that stunned both families. On Saturday evening, as Martha was preparing Sunday supper, she discovered Ruby's bed empty and a note written in the careful script that Martha had taught her. "Dear Grandmother Martha, and Papa Samuel, I can't choose between you because I love you both. Everyone is fighting because of me, and people are getting hurt because of me. If I go away, maybe you can stop being angry at each other and be friends like you should be. I have my 3 pennies, and I know how to take care of myself. Please, don't worry about me. I just need to find a place where I belong. Love, Ruby." Martha's scream brought neighbors running, and within minutes, word had reached Samuel at his ranch. For the first time since the custody battle began, Samuel and Martha found themselves united in their terror over Ruby's disappearance. "She's headed for the railroad station," Martha said with certainty, born of knowing Ruby's habits and thought processes. "That child's got it in her head that she can solve our problems by removing herself from the equation." Samuel was already saddling his horse. "The last train east leaves at 9 o'clock. If we hurry, we might catch her before she does something that can't be undone." As they raced toward town together, Samuel on horseback, Martha in her cart driven by one of her neighbors, both adults realized that their legal battle had created exactly the situation Elizabeth had feared most: a child torn between worlds, belonging fully to neither, forced to choose between the people who loved her most. The custody papers lay forgotten on Martha's kitchen table, their legal authority suddenly meaningless in the face of a desperate child's attempt to solve an adult problem through sacrifice and self-imposed exile. The real test of Samuel and Martha's love for Ruby would come not in a courtroom, but in their ability to find her and convince her that some battles are worth fighting, and some families are worth the complexity they bring to the world. Samuel's horse thundered down the dusty road toward Cedar Ridge's railroad station, its hooves keeping time with his racing heartbeat. Beside him, Martha's cart bounced over the rough terrain as her neighbor's mule strained to match the pace Samuel was setting. The sun was already touching the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed ominous rather than beautiful. "How long until the eastbound train?" Samuel called over the sound of hoofbeats and creaking wheels. 20 minutes, maybe less," Martha replied, her voice tight with fear. "That child's got no business trying to travel alone, especially not at her age." Ruby's handwritten letter was folded in Samuel's vest pocket, its careful words seared into his memory. The letter represented everything that had gone wrong with their custody battle. An 8-year-old child taking responsibility for adult conflicts, trying to solve problems that weren't hers to solve through sacrifice and self-exile. As they raced toward town, Samuel found himself looking at Martha with new eyes. The woman beside him wasn't the kidnapper he'd initially seen her as, nor was she simply the loving grandmother Ruby knew her to be. She was a complex person who'd made an impossible choice under extraordinary circumstances, guided by the dying wishes of a woman who'd understood the harsh realities of their world better than anyone. "Mrs. Washington," Samuel said during a brief moment when the road smoothed out enough for conversation, "I owe you an apology." Martha glanced at him with surprise. "For what?" "For not understanding what Elizabeth asked you to do, for not seeing that you were trying to protect Ruby from something I couldn't even imagine." Martha's grip on the cart's reins tightened. "Mr. Hayes, your wife knew you loved her, but she also knew that love alone wouldn't be enough to shield Ruby from what this world does to children who don't fit into neat categories." "She was right," Samuel admitted, the words tasting bitter but necessary. I would have tried to hide Ruby's heritage. I would have told myself I was protecting her, but really I would have been protecting myself from the social consequences. The railroad station came into view as they crested the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge's main street. Samuel could see the black locomotive already at the platform, steam rising from its smokestack like incense from an altar. Passengers were beginning to board, their luggage being loaded into the freight car with efficient dispatch. There, Martha pointed toward the station platform. I see her. Ruby stood near the passenger car steps, her small figure almost lost among the adults preparing to board. She clutched a worn cloth bundle that contained her few possessions, and Samuel could see, even from a distance, that her face was streaked with tears. Samuel and Martha arrived at the station simultaneously, both dismounting and running toward. Ruby with the desperate urgency of parents racing to prevent disaster. "Ruby!" Martha called, her voice carrying across the platform with maternal authority that made several passengers turn to look. Ruby spun around at the sound of her name, and Samuel saw his daughter's face properly for the first time since her disappearance. The child looked exhausted and frightened, her green eyes red-rimmed from crying and wide with the overwhelming realization of what she'd been about to do. "Grandmother Martha! Papa Samuel!" Ruby's voice was small and uncertain. I was just... You were just about to make the biggest mistake of your young life," Martha said, but her tone was gentle rather than scolding. She knelt down and opened her arms, and Ruby ran into them with the relief of a lost child finding safe harbor. Samuel approached more slowly, giving Ruby space to process the emotions that were clearly overwhelming her 8-year-old mind. Over Martha's shoulder, Ruby looked at him with eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so young. "I thought if I left, you and Grandmother Martha could be friends again," Ruby whispered. "I thought maybe you'd be happier without me causing all this trouble." Samuel's heart broke at the words. He knelt beside Martha, creating a small circle of protection around his daughter. "Ruby, sweetheart, you're not causing trouble. The trouble comes from adults not knowing how to handle complicated situations. But everyone in town is fighting. About me. Mrs. Patterson says I don't belong with Grandmother Martha, and the folks on our side of town say I don't belong with you. Where do I belong, Papa Samuel?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the train's smokestack. Around them, other passengers continued their boarding preparations, but Samuel, Martha, and Ruby existed in their own bubble of family crisis and resolution. Martha smoothed Ruby's hair with the tender gestures of 9 years of motherhood. "Child, belonging isn't about what other people think. It's about love and care and making sure you grow up knowing exactly how precious you are. Your grandmother's right," Samuel added, his voice rough with emotion. "And Ruby, I need you to understand something. I don't want you to choose between us. I never should have put you in a position where you felt like you had to choose." Ruby looked back and forth between the two adults who loved her most. "But the court papers say..." "The court papers can be changed," Samuel interrupted. "What matters is what's best for you, not what's convenient for the legal system." The train whistle blew, signaling final boarding call. The conductor stepped onto the platform and began his final preparations for departure. Ruby watched the activity with wide eyes, seeming to truly comprehend for the first time how close she'd come to disappearing from their lives forever. "I was scared," Ruby admitted, her voice barely audible over the sound of the steam engine. "I was scared that if I stayed, I'd have to choose between the two people I love most in the world." Martha and Samuel exchanged a look over Ruby's head, a look that carried 9 years of misunderstanding, recent revelations about Elizabeth's fears and wishes, and the shared terror they'd just experienced at nearly losing the child they both cherished. "Ruby," Martha said softly, "what if I told you that you don't have to choose? What if there was a way for you to have both of us in your life?" Ruby's tear-streaked face lifted with the first hint of hope she'd shown since the custody battle. "Began. Is that possible?" Samuel reached out and took one of Ruby's hands in his own, noting how small and fragile it felt. I think it might be, sweetheart, but only if all three of us work together to figure out what that looks like. The train began to move, slowly pulling away from the platform with its cargo of passengers bound for distant destinations. Ruby watched it go with something that looked like relief rather than regret. "Can we go home now?" she asked, and neither Samuel nor Martha missed the fact that she didn't specify which home she meant. "Yes," Martha said, gathering Ruby into her arms for the journey back to town. "We can go home, all of us together." As the train disappeared around the bend, carrying its passengers toward destinations unknown, Ruby reached into her small cloth bundle and withdrew 3 worn pennies, the same coins she'd offered Samuel that first day in Henderson's General Store. Her small fingers trembled as she held them out to him, the copper catching the last rays of the setting sun. "Here, Papa Samuel," she said, her voice breaking with the weight of too much responsibility for such young shoulders. "Take these. Back. I shouldn't have offered them to you that day. If I hadn't tried to help, none of this fighting would have happened." Samuel stared at the pennies in his daughter's palm, seeing not just 3 cents, but the symbol of everything that had gone wrong and right in the past weeks. Ruby's act of kindness had indeed set in motion the events that led to this crisis, but it had also revealed truths that needed to be uncovered and brought together a family that had been separated by deception and good intentions gone awry. "Ruby, sweetheart," Samuel said gently, closing her fingers around the coins, "don't you ever regret having a kind heart. What you did that day, offering to help a stranger, that wasn't the problem. The problem was adults who didn't know how to handle the truth when it finally came to light." Martha nodded emphatically, her own voice thick with emotion. "Child, your kindness is one of the most beautiful things about you. Don't you let this situation make you afraid to help people." Ruby looked between them with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8-year-old face. "But everyone's been so angry. The whole town is talking about us. Mrs. Henderson won't even look at me when I come into the store now." The innocent observation hit both adults like a physical blow. In their focus on legal rights and parental claims, they'd lost sight of how their battle was affecting Ruby's daily life, her sense of belonging in the community, and her understanding of her own worth. Samuel felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. For weeks, he'd been focused on winning custody, on claiming his paternal rights, on rectifying what he saw as Martha's theft of his child. But looking at Ruby now, this frightened, overwhelmed little girl who was trying to return her most precious possessions to undo the kindness that had revealed her true identity, Samuel realized that winning might mean losing what mattered most. "Ruby," he said, his voice carrying a new note of certainty, "I want to ask you something important, and I want you to answer honestly. What would make you happiest? Not what you think I want to hear, or what you think would cause the least trouble, but what would truly make you happy?" Ruby considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Around them, the railroad station was emptying as evening fell over Cedar Ridge, but the three of them remained in their own bubble of family crisis and potential resolution. "I want to live with Grandmother Martha," Ruby said finally, her voice gaining strength as she spoke her truth. "She's the only mama I've ever known, and her house is my home. But I want to know you too, Papa Samuel. I want to understand where I came from and what it means that you're my father. I don't want to choose between you anymore." Martha closed, her eyes feeling a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that Ruby wanted to stay with her, but fear that Samuel's legal rights would override what his daughter actually wanted. Samuel surprised them both with his response. "Then that's what we'll arrange," he said simply. "Ruby, you'll stay with Martha. She's earned the right to be called your mother through 9 years of love and care. But I'd like to be part of your life too, if you're willing. I'd like to teach you about the ranch and about your mother Elizabeth, and help you understand all the parts of yourself." "You mean it?" Ruby's voice was small with hope. "I don't have to choose." "You don't have to choose," Samuel confirmed. "Martha, would you Be willing to share Ruby with me? Not legally. She can stay with you as her primary guardian. But could we work out an arrangement where I can spend time with her, help provide for her education and future, be the father she deserves? Martha's weathered face showed the internal battle she was fighting. For 9 years, she'd been Ruby's sole guardian, protector, and family. The thought of sharing that role with anyone was terrifying, but as she looked at Ruby's hopeful expression and Samuel's earnest face, Martha realized that her own fears couldn't be allowed to limit Ruby's opportunities. "Mr. Hayes," Martha said slowly, "what exactly are you proposing?" Samuel had been thinking about this moment during their frantic ride to the railroad station, considering what Elizabeth's journal had revealed about her fears and wishes. "I'm proposing that we legally recognize Ruby as my daughter, which gives her inheritance rights and social standing, but that she continues to live primarily with you. I'd like her to spend time at the ranch, maybe weekends, maybe part of each summer, so she can learn that side of her heritage too. I'll contribute to her education and her future, but you remain her day-to-day guardian." "And when she's grown?" Martha asked. "When she's old enough to make her own choices about where she belongs?" "Then the choice will be hers to make," Samuel replied, "just as it should have been all along." Ruby looked back and forth between them, hardly daring to believe that the impossible might be possible. "Grandmother Martha, would that be all right with you?" Martha knelt down and gathered Ruby into her arms, holding her close, while she considered the proposal that would change all their lives. "Child, all I've ever wanted is for you to be happy, safe, and proud of who you are. If having your papa in your life makes you happier, then that's what we'll do." Ruby burst into tears, not the desperate sobs of earlier, but tears of relief and gratitude. She threw her arms around Martha's neck, then reached out to include Samuel in their embrace. "I love you both," she whispered. "I love you so much it scared me." As the three of them stood together on the empty railroad platform, Samuel felt the 3 pennies pressed between their joined hands. The coins that had started as Ruby's offer of kindness to a stranger had become something else entirely, a symbol of the love that had brought a scattered family together despite impossible odds. "Ruby," Samuel said softly, "you keep those pennies. They represent the best part of you, the part that sees someone in need and wants to help, no matter what it costs. Don't ever lose that." Ruby nodded, clutching the coins tight in her small fist. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they worked out the practical details of their unusual family arrangement. There would be legal documents to file, social conventions to navigate, and community reactions to weather. But tonight, as they walked home together through the gathering darkness of Cedar Ridge, Ruby Washington Hayes had something she'd never possessed before. A complete family that honored all parts of her heritage and loved her exactly as she was. 1 year later, Ruby Hayes Washington stood on the front porch of Martha's cabin, carefully braiding her hair in the intricate pattern that her grandmother had taught her, a style passed down through generations of strong women who'd learned to find beauty and pride in their African heritage. The morning sun caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, and her green eyes sparkled with the confidence of a child who'd finally learned exactly where she belonged in the world. Today was Saturday, which meant Papa Samuel would be coming to collect her for their weekend at the ranch. It had taken months to establish the rhythm of their unusual family arrangement, but now the transitions felt as natural as the changing seasons. Samuel's approach was announced by the familiar sound of his horse's hooves on the packed earth road. Ruby grinned and waved as he came into view, noting with satisfaction that he was riding the gentle mare he'd bought specifically for her riding lessons. "Good morning, sweetheart," Samuel called as he dismounted. "Ready for another weekend of ranch adventures?" "Yes, Papa Samuel." Grandmother Martha made us both some of her molasses cookies for the ride. Martha emerged from the cabin, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. At 69, she moved with the same dignity and purpose that had characterized her entire life. But there was a lightness to her bearing now that hadn't been there during the dark months of the custody battle. "Those cookies are still warm," she warned Samuel with mock seriousness, "so don't you let that child eat them all before lunch." Samuel grinned, accepting the cloth-wrapped bundle with the appreciation of a man who'd learned to value Martha's cooking almost as much as her wisdom. "I make no promises about my own restraint, but I'll try to keep Ruby from spoiling her appetite." The easy banter between Samuel and Martha had developed gradually over the months as they'd learned to navigate their co-parenting relationship. It hadn't been simple. There had been moments of tension, disagreements about Ruby's education and social activities, and the ongoing challenge of presenting a united front to a community still adjusting to their unconventional family structure. But their shared love for Ruby had provided common ground, and their shared memories of Elizabeth had created unexpected bonds of understanding and respect. Ruby hugged Martha goodbye, with the unconscious confidence of a child who knew she was deeply loved and would see her grandmother again in 2 days. "I'll practice my letters while I'm at the ranch, Grandmother Martha. Papa Samuel said he'd help me write a story about the new foal." "You do that, baby. And remember what I taught you about keeping your heritage alive through stories and traditions." As Apchi, they rode toward the ranch, Ruby chattering excitedly about the week's events. Samuel reflected on the remarkable transformation in his daughter's life and his own. Ruby had blossomed under their shared care, growing confident in her biracial identity and proud of both sides of her heritage. Martha had taught her about her mother's hidden history, sharing stories of Elizabeth's fears and dreams while helping Ruby understand the strength that came from surviving in a world that didn't always welcome complexity. Samuel had shared different stories, tales of Elizabeth's laughter and love, memories of their courtship and marriage, glimpses of the woman Elizabeth had been when she felt safe to be herself. Ruby had absorbed it all with the resilience of youth, creating a coherent sense of self from the various threads of her identity. The Hayes Ranch had become Ruby's second home, complete with her own room decorated with items that reflected both her interests and her heritage. Samuel had commissioned a portrait of Elizabeth to hang above Ruby's bed, and Martha had contributed a quilt made from fabric scraps that told the story of their family's journey through its patterns and colors. Samuel had legally adopted Ruby, while allowing her to keep Martha's surname as part of her identity, Ruby Hayes Washington, a name that honored all her family connections and proclaimed her right to belong in multiple worlds. The arrangement had required patience and creativity to navigate social conventions, but Cedar Ridge had gradually adapted to their unusual family structure. Samuel's financial support had enabled Ruby to attend the new integrated school he'd funded, an institution that welcomed children of all backgrounds and had become a source of pride for the entire community. Martha continued her work as a midwife, but now with Samuel's backing and financial support. Her reputation had only grown stronger in the wake of the custody resolution, as people came to understand the wisdom and sacrifice behind her decision to raise Ruby. The wooden box of medical supplies that Samuel had purchased for her was the finest equipment any midwife in 3 counties possessed. Ruby had learned to read and write with a proficiency that impressed everyone who knew her. She devoured books about adventure and exploration, but also showed a keen interest in the practical skills that both Martha and Samuel could teach her. She could deliver a calf, tend a vegetable garden, prepare traditional medicines, and manage a household budget with equal competence. Most importantly, Ruby had retained the generous spirit that had started their family's transformation. She still carried her 3 pennies everywhere, now kept in a small leather pouch that Samuel had made for her. But the coins had become something more than money. They were a reminder that small acts of kindness could change the world in ways no one could predict. The opportunity to prove this came on a warm afternoon in late summer when Ruby and Martha were walking through town after a successful visit to Henderson's general store. The relationship with the Henderson family had improved considerably. Once the community accepted Ruby's place in their society, and Dorothy Henderson had even begun teaching Ruby some of the finer points of commerce and customer relations. As they passed the church, Ruby noticed a young boy sitting on the steps, his clothes worn and his face streaked with the kind of despair that came from troubles too big for small shoulders to carry. Ruby recognized him as Tommy Sullivan, whose father had been injured in a ranch accident and whose family was struggling to make ends meet. Without hesitation, Ruby approached the boy and sat down beside him on the church steps. "Tommy, are you all right?" The boy looked up with eyes that were too old for his 10-year-old face. "My ma sent me to ask Reverend Johnson if the church can help with Papa's medicine, but he's not here. Don't know what we're going to do." Ruby looked back at Martha, who nodded with the understanding that came from raising a child with an instinctive desire to help others. Ruby reached into her leather pouch and withdrew her 3 pennies, the same coins that had started her family's journey toward wholeness. "Here," Ruby said, pressing the coins into Tommy's hand. "It's not much, but maybe it'll help with the medicine. And Tommy, things have a way of working out when people care about each other." Tommy stared at the pennies in amazement, not just because of the gift, but because Ruby Hayes Washington, the richest child in Cedar Ridge, had noticed his troubles and cared enough to help. Martha watched the exchange with tears in her eyes, seeing the completion of a circle that had begun with Elizabeth's dying wish to raise a child who would be proud of all parts of herself and generous toward others. That evening, as Ruby told Samuel about her encounter with Tommy Sullivan, she articulated something that both adults had come to understand, but neither had been able to express so simply. "Papa Samuel, I used to think family was about blood and who you look like and where you come from, but I think it's really about who loves you and who you choose to love back, isn't it?" Samuel nodded, thinking about the photograph that now sat on his mantel, an image of the 3 of them taken at the county fair, their faces glowing with the happiness of people who'd found their way to each other despite impossible odds. It wasn't a conventional family portrait, but it captured something more valuable than convention. It showed a family created by choice, sustained by love, and strengthened by the understanding that some bonds transcend biology, race, and social expectations. Elizabeth's dream for her daughter had been realized in ways she could never have imagined. Ruby had grown up proud of her heritage, all of it, while learning to navigate multiple worlds with grace and confidence. She'd been raised by people who saw her complexity as a strength rather than a burden, and who'd taught her that belonging wasn't about fitting into narrow categories, but about being loved for exactly who she was. As Ruby fell asleep that night, in her room at the ranch, her 3 pennies secure in their leather pouch on her bedside table, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the kindness that had brought her family together. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new opportunities to help others, and new chances to live up to the legacy of love that Elizabeth, Martha, and Samuel had created for her. In Cedar Ridge, Texas, in the year 1888, the Hayes Washington family had proven that love could indeed conquer the artificial boundaries that society tried to impose on human hearts. And 3 worn pennies served as a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures of kindness can change not just individual lives, but entire communities forever.